is recording. We're going to be concentrating on the late 18th, but into really the 19th centuries in this class, and then the early 20th. The lecture that I asked you to listen to, the Captivate lecture that I asked you to listen to online, that I know you will listen to very soon, gives you an introduction to the concept of modern and modern art, and really gives you some background on the fact that historically one can talk about modern in terms of the French Revolution. That's 1789. That's the end of the 18th century. And I wanted you to have some of that background on the 18th century because I'm going to move now to talk about one of the most important components of both the 18th and 19th centuries, and that's what's known as the academy. And so that's what we're going to concentrate on today. And what I'd like you to understand about this lecture on the academy is that the whole course it revolves around this concept in terms of modern art. So to say that it's important is an understatement. So much of what happens in French art in the 19th century, in particular, in terms of what we call the avant-garde, those who are ahead of their time, who are rejecting past tradition, especially in terms of France, can be seen as a reaction against the academic system. So, because of that, it would seem to make sense that we attempt to understand the place of that academic system or the academy. And we're going to concentrate on painting. Painting tends to be ahead of certainly of sculpture and architecture in terms of artists moving in a new or different direction. Sculpture tends to be more conservative, and architecture as well. So we're going to concentrate on painting. The term academy as a school goes back to 4th century Greece, so it's not a term that was coined for the 19th century. In ancient Greece, in Athens, it was called the Academia. It was a school in Athens where Plato instructed students. An academy in its more modern sense derives from the 17th century, when academies or schools of education in the arts, letters, and sciences were established in many European capitals. The earliest academy of art was founded in Florence in the late 16th century by Giorgio Vasari, V-A-S-A-R-I, Vasari. V is in Victor, A-S-A-R-I, Giorgio. Art academies were institutions which directed and shaped artistic production through their training and indoctrination of a younger generation of artists, through the support of certain stylistic categories, a preference for certain kinds of subject matter, especially the primary importance of the nude and one's ability to represent the nude, and their rewards for artists who conformed most readily to all of this training, to all of what one might also say are constraints. The rise of the academies created ultimately a division between artists who worked within the academy, who had gained access, who towed the line, so to speak, and those who didn't and were excluded. By the 19th century, there existed a division between academicians and independents that was both material and ideological. What I'm showing you here is an 18th century work. This is an engraving that seeks to visualize the concept of the academy, in which we see these young artists being trained by old artists or older artists and being taught all of the basics, from perspective to anatomy to drawing from the live model, and then we have some sources of inspiration who seem to be floating up above on the upper right-hand side. The academy that's going to be important for us, because we're going to concentrate on France, is the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture, the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, founded in 1648, under Louis XIV, whose picture you see right there. Since the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture was, in fact, founded under and by the King of France, it would remain under royal patronage and thus control until the French Revolution in 1789. By the way, architecture was founded as a separate academy just a few years later. This is the Academy of Painting and Sculpture that we're talking about. And although the academy would change dramatically after the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, it was reestablished with the restoration of kingship in France in 1814, so that many of the older traditions would, in fact, be revived. In France, the spirit behind the creation of the academy was to control the production of the arts, and in turn to establish an appropriate national character for French art, all of it directed through the royalty. For over 2 centuries, French artistic life centered around the academy. And although it changed names, becoming part of the Institut de France, as a merger of 5 academies, including the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, with the reorganization of French artistic life, again, as a result of the French Revolution. In its definitive state, teaching in the academy was very much divided into certain levels or stages of training, validation, and recognition. So how did the academic training work? Well, it worked in this way, that you began as a student. Élève means student. Translated more roughly for the purposes of training in the arts, you are an apprentice. And those apprentices are students who had shown evidence of very strong ability, usually by winning major prizes for their work, qualified for the next level, which is what's called journeyman. By the way, if this is starting to look like the setup of a guild, a classic sort of guild system, it certainly is based on that tradition. The journeyman was required to present a reception piece on a given subject within 1 year to the academy. The subject of the reception piece designated whether or not you would be accepted into the academy as an academicien, as an academician, as a master. And depending on what the subject of your painting, of your work of art was, made a place for you within the hierarchy of the academy, and you were named a master. It is the masters who get the best commissions from the state, who make the most money, obviously, who have the greatest prestige. And that's what you want if you're an artist within the academic system. Teaching concentrated on the study of the male nude, since history painting emphasized the human figure engaged in dramatic action, and history painting was considered to be the top of the academic hierarchy of subjects. So right away, what we need to understand is that some subjects were considered to be important, and others were considered not to be as important. This is literally like, if you like a ladder, all right, with different rungs. At the very top is history painting. History painting was considered to be the finest and the most brilliant subject that an artist could paint. It was seen as, in fact, encompassing all the other forms or subjects, from the human figure to portraiture to landscape to genre to still life. So, history painting, whether sacred or profane, so it could be the Bible, for instance, or history, was followed by, on the rungs, are you ready? History's at the top. Portraiture. Genre. G-E-N-R-E. Genre. What does that mean? It means everyday life. Everyday life. Genre. G-E-N-R-E. Coming down on the ladder's rungs, still life. And then farther down, landscape. The painters with the greatest prestige painted history paintings. Those who had lesser prestige, perhaps had less respect, were landscape painters. On the strength of a reception piece, a journeyman artist was accepted or refused status as a master academicien, as we've seen in the previous slide, which was the greatest honor an artist could receive. At the beginning of the organization of the Academy, it preserved the tradition of which it always emphasized to those who would attack the organization of the Academy, that it admitted an unlimited number of members, and that it also admitted, in other words, someone didn't have to die for you to become a master. And it admitted women to membership in the Academy. Oh, but hold it right there. I do have to add that there would eventually be a limit on the number of women, and women could only enter the Academy in minor subject areas. So you could not be taken into the Academy as a, what's at the top? History painter. You had to paint still life or landscape or something else. Even when admitted, women did not enjoy the same privileges as male artists. For example, they were barred from taking life drawing classes. Why? Why can't a woman take a life drawing class? Can't hear you. Yeah, you're not going to let a woman look at a male nude. Membership in the Academy was not only a matter of prestige, more importantly, its members enjoyed the monopoly of royal commissions and free access to the salon. The salon, the exhibition arm of the Academy. Established as early as 1664, it was named after the Grand Salon, the large salon of the Louvre, which, of course, you know that the Louvre, which today we all know as a museum, was a palace of the French king in Paris. So initially, this was a large room where paintings were hung annually or biannually in a salon to exhibit the greatest work of French artists of the time. The salon was not actually held regularly to the public until 1737, but it was an unparalleled way for an artist to become known and to find patrons for, I will say, his art, but his or her art. And you can see what would be the drawback here in terms of what you're looking at with this salon from the 18th century. So the drawback. If you wrote to your mother and said, "I have a painting hanging in the salon," yeah, it is so incredibly crowded here that how would you even see anything? But the fact is, of course, that if your work was accepted in the salon, that alone was prestigious. It was an unparalleled way for an artist to become known and to find patrons. Salons were attended eventually by thousands of people, and thousands of catalogs were sold. It stimulated a flood of critical reviews, and the resultant publicity could make an artist's reputation. So up in this salon, we're looking at a very large painting, which was a commission of the Napoleonic regime, of the crowning of Napoleon, but in fact, Napoleon crowned himself, as you may remember. And so what David painted instead is the crowning of Josephine, his empress. And so that's the painting that everyone is excited about and looking at. And here you can see the crowds of people inside of the salon in the early 19th century. Access to the salon was free to academicians or masters. So you could submit to the salon and your work would have to be shown. All other artists had to submit work to a jury. Now, as we're going to see, in certain so-called revolutionary times, one time at the end of the 18th century, one time in the 19th century, the salon was actually opened to everyone. And, of course, that created chaos in the 19th century, as we'll see. The need for more easily accessible exhibitions in which young artists or those who had failed to become masters or failed admission to the academy could even show their works would be one of the great conflicts of the 19th century and would be one of the reasons why the academy becomes irrelevant. Because if you're only going to keep it open for certain individuals whose work, in fact, represents a small group of often very conservative masters, then you're not going to see very much progress. It's interesting, just as an aside, I don't know if you watched the Oscars last night. I missed most of it, but a silent movie won the Oscar. And there has been some criticism of the choice of that movie because it's thought to be a kind of retrogressive kind of movie going back to the silent era with a very classic kind of love story and conflict, and that it really has nothing to do with the contemporary world and the kinds of technology, the kinds of stories that might be more relevant to the larger population, to a larger audience. And the reason that it won is because the average age of Academy members, and I'm talking about the Oscars now, is like, what, 60-something? So did anyone read that? Am I telling you? So I just see it as an interesting kind of analogy to this situation. The salon jury, made up of academicians, could hold life or death fate for the artist. Here is a meeting of painting jurors. You can see at the end of the 19th century, all the jurors are old, bearded males wearing hats and holding canes or umbrellas that they're thrashing around, making points here. It's not a very diverse group who are making decisions about what art will be shown in the salon. Thousands of works might be submitted to the salon jury. The largest salons might show as many as 5,000 paintings, hung crowded on vast walls, frame to frame, from eye level to ceiling. I particularly love this cartoon on the left-hand side, which is called The Last Day to Submit Your Entry to the Salon Jury. And then on the right-hand side, some of the works as they are being hung within the salon. You can see one absolutely enormous work. And as we were just saying, the pictures in the salon, the paintings, were literally hung almost from floor to ceiling. The poorest locations, behind a pillar, in the dark, away from any window light, might be next to invisible, but at least your work was accepted and hung, receiving, in essence, the stamp of approval. Literally, there was a salon stamp on the back of the painting, while rejected paintings would be returned to the artist stamped with R, refusé, refuse. Try to sell that if your patron comes in and turns your painting around and decides to buy things that only had been accepted for the salon. In fact, you could have an option for a buyer, but only if your painting was accepted into the salon. Otherwise, they wouldn't buy it. It's actually only after the Revolution that works in the salon were put up, were known to be for sale. We also have the tradition the tradition in terms of the Medal of Honor begun under the Napoleonic era of distributing awards to the most highly recognized artists and works of art. So, for instance, I'm showing you here, and by the way, I'm using a lot of these works just to give you the context. These are, you'll know when I'm talking about a work that's important because we'll spend much more time on it. So this is Charles X distributing awards to artists at the Salon of 1824. Monarchy has been reestablished in France, and you can see the great ceremony taking place here. The highest award was the Grand Medal of Honor, which also brought a monetary amount, which was very nice. So now we've learned about some of the most important organizations that are associated with the Academy, but I want to introduce you to another one. This is the École des Beaux-Arts, école in French meaning school, the School of Fine Arts. Established in 1795 to undertake specialized training of promising students, with entry based on merit. That's always nice to hear. Inculcating in these students an appreciation for a craftsman's approach to painting and sculpture. This was the most important school in France to enter before you try to begin your trek through the academic process, the École des Beaux-Arts. It was very difficult to become a student here, and you might not be surprised to hear that women were denied entrance to the École des Beaux-Arts. That was until 1896, when the École des Beaux-Arts was open to women. By that time, the École des Beaux-Arts was irrelevant. The École was founded on the concept of separation of administrative and honorary functions into which category the Academy had fallen, and teaching responsibilities which had been neglected. The curriculum at the École des Beaux-Arts had no specific course of study, although drawing instruction was stressed. So I do have to say, and I will be saying this again, and we'll see it in the studying the works of a number of artists. You had to be an outstanding artist already, having gone to school, the School of Fine Arts in your hometown for several years. You needed backing and patronage, and then you could gain entrance to the École des Beaux-Arts. So you didn't go to the École des Beaux-Arts to learn how to draw. You were going there to perfect your drawing. You already were considered an outstanding student. Drawing with stress, drawing from engravings. Why would you draw from engravings? Why don't you just start drawing from life? What's the thing about an engraving? What's the dominant element in engraving, which is a print? You can make copies. What's the dominant formal element that you notice in an engraving? How do you get that, though? How do you get shadow? How do you get contrast in engraving? What is an engraving based on? Any printmakers here? You can't make an engraved image without, gosh, how else can I put this? Line. Yes, line. You cannot make an engraving without being an expert at line. When you talk about shadow, you create shadow in an engraving by increasing the number of lines or hatch marks, because that's where the ink falls in, and that's where you get a darker area once you produce a print. So line, drawing from engravings, teaches you about the primacy of line. And then once you have become an expert at drawing from engravings, and one can imagine that that's what's going on here in this wonderful illustration from the Diderot Encyclopedia of Knowledge from the 18th century, which seeks to show an academic course of study. You can see that they are drawing from an engraving, and they're gathered around looking at it, and the line is being pointed out by the instructor. What comes after your expert ability to draw from engraving? You move to casts of classical sculpture, and you begin to draw from plaster casts that are based on the Parthenon sculptures or other great Greek or Roman works. We see some of those plaster cast body parts represented as hanging in this studio in the École des Beaux-Arts. And you can see a smaller plaster cast here of a seated figure. And again, the students are being taught to learn and to draw from the cast. And then what's the last thing you get to do? This is a live model. So you're going to be working from the live model. Beginning with his earliest training, the student was taught the use of line. Linear design is the basis of visual representation, and the standard for successful drawing became the precise imitation of the smallest detail. Behind this emphasis on line lay a philosophical rationale that is not new to the 18th or 19th centuries, but it proclaimed this ideal that line appeals to the intellect, and that anything else in a painting, for instance, color, appeals to the senses. And line is what needs to dominate in a painting. So color, when it is finally taught, is taught to be conservative and confined to the way the line defines the form, employed only to reinforce line. So let me go back a little bit historically here as a little bit of a tangent. Those of you who've had the History of Art 1B may remember that when Michelangelo went to visit the great Venetian artist Titian in Rome in the early 16th century, he went with Vasari, by the way, who started the first Academy of Art. And they went to visit Titian, who was visiting Rome and doing a portrait of the Pope and other work. And so here you have these two great artists, Michelangelo and Tiziano Vecellio. And they meet each other. How are you? Very nice to meet you. And Michelangelo looks at Titian's work, And he says, oh, this is wonderful. You are a master. I admire you. And then they leave. Michelangelo says to Vasari, it's too bad he never learned to draw. Michelangelo's work, if you remember the Renaissance, is based on line, on contour. If you know the Venetian painters, like Titian, their art is based in what? What is it based in? Color. Color. And one of the reasons, and when you go to Italy, if you have not already been, you'll see it visually. In Venice, everything is so colorful, and light reflects so brilliantly. Venetian artists see the world differently, and that's how they represent it in their art. So in Florence, there's a greater sense of austerity, I suppose one might say, in terms of visual acuity. And in Florence, they taught line and contour. It's the same old sort of canard. It's the same old argument that's coming up. I shouldn't say coming up again. It really had never been lost. Behind this emphasis on line, then, lay that philosophical rationale that line is superior and that the conservative use of color confined within line should be the only way to paint. Intimately linked with this conservative handling of color was the Academy's doctrinal concept of what was called the fini. The fini. F-I-N-I. What does fini mean when you come to the end of a book? The end, finished, exactly. And a fini in art means a dutifully finished surface. A dutifully finished surface. And I'm going to come back to this at the very end of the lecture. Now, lessons in anatomy and perspective were also taught, and out of this experience emerged a common sense principle to be invoked by the Academy over and over again into the 19th century. Are you ready? I did a special effect. Let's see if it works. I like that. I should have it go a little longer. Control instruction and you will control style. That's the whole point of the establishment of an academy by the King of France. Control instruction and you will control style. What is style? A manner or way of artistic expression with specific characteristics. That's style. And as far as the Academy is concerned, the style needs to emphasize what formal element? Line. Yes. So what about originality? What if I have a different idea? Well, I won't get into the École des Beaux-Arts to even start training there. Originality was ruled out. You know, originality, that's amazing to us today because originality is so important for contemporary art, right? If you're going to make your name, you better do something different because if you keep doing what's been done, or repeat something, no one's going to be interested in you. It has to be innovative. It has to be new. This is simply not acceptable at this time. The curriculum of the École des Beaux-Arts assumed a complex series of competitions. So this is important because remember, the École des Beaux-Arts didn't have a really strict kind of curriculum, although I've just told you the areas that were certainly covered. But it assumed also within all of that additional training a series of competitions while you are training, from individual figure studies in lesser competitions to the ultimate contest, which was the grand prize. And it was called the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize. how long they gave out the Rome Prize? Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize. The Prix de Rome competition was the competition that if you were a serious artist, trained in the academic tradition, you had to win. It proceeded in stages, beginning with a sketch of an assigned subject, which you had to execute in one day. 16 to 20 students would be chosen from the first round to go on to do a nude figure study in approximately 4 days. And so on, and so on. Competition after competition, eliminating students. The whole process took about 72 days. Typically, you were confined to a cubicle. This is a view. You had been given your assignment. You went to carry it out. This work won the Prix de Torse, that is the Torso Prize, in the Prix de Rome competition for an artist whom we are going to spend some time talking about, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Individual studies such as these were the basic units in which you would be proving to the masters that you could then take them and create a larger, extremely competent composition. The Prix de Rome allowed for a traveling fellowship. The student was awarded money for the best painting, and went to study at the French Academy in Rome for a period of several months to years. Oh, by the way, in case I forgot to mention it, which I know I did, women were excluded from competition in the Prix de Rome until the end of the 19th century, when the Prix de Rome was irrelevant. Now, when I say these things become irrelevant, in large part, that's not because they didn't continue and have legitimacy in France. But the fact is, eventually, by excluding so many artists with different points of view, there has to be another outlet, right? And that's what we're going to see happening in France in the 19th century. One couldn't imagine today not having all of the different venues, all of the places where artists can choose to show their works. But this was simply not the case in France during much of the period that we are talking about. So the Grand Prix, the Prix de Rome, was the most desired official student award, that traveling fellowship to study in Rome. The subject for the contest, for this final painting, were selected for the student from subjects within the hierarchy of ancient history, the Bible, or mythology. All of those were considered to be history subjects. So, ancient history, the Bible, mythology. This is the Prix de Rome winner in 1869. Have you ever heard of Luc-Olivier Merson? Have you ever heard of Claude Monet? It's about the same period. But Monet didn't go to the École des Beaux-Arts. It was in the private ateliers of masters of the Academy that served as stepping stones in training and hope for admission to the École des Beaux-Arts. So I'm backing up here a little bit and telling you that you had to train in your hometown and be very well trained. And then you hoped to gain entree to the École des Beaux-Arts. But one of the ways to do that was to make a connection to one of the academic masters who ran his own studio. And you could pay him to train you, and then he might become like a mentor and help you get in to the École des Beaux-Arts. It was very common practice for young artists to go under the wing of a master artist, and this could happen in a number of different ways, certainly usually by knowing someone, but your atelier, your portfolio had to be very strong as well. So you would enter what's called an atelier. You see the word? Atelier. That's the private studio of a master. And the studio practices, the atelier practices, were oriented around the Prix de Rome competition. As this competition was the goal of every serious art student, private instruction in the atelier was organized to prepare the pupil to meet the requirements and the different tests that would be involved. Experienced artists with years of provincial training always enrolled in an atelier before competing for the Prix de Rome. The course of instruction in the ateliers was more basic and elementary in approach than the École des Beaux-Arts, but again, you needed to have some training and be a good, solid artist for the master to even allow you into his atelier. In keeping with the belief that art should be systematic and disciplined, drawing was emphasized and divided into categories from individual facial features to body parts to full-length figures. This is the atelier of a very famous 19th century French academic painter named Cormon. In his studio at the end of the 19th century were artists such as, are you ready? Toulouse-Lautrec, right here. And there's Cormon. Sorry, there's Cormon. Copying a cast was an exercise principally designed within the atelier to heighten the student's awareness of the effects of light and shade and to emphasize the importance, the absolute importance of value contrast. Value refers to light and dark. Here we go. We're going back again to that idea of line and engraving. So we're reinforcing all of that that we know to be true within the École des Beaux-Arts. When the student had mastered drawing from casts, he was assigned to work from a live nude model. And at this point in his training, I keep saying his, and I want to apologize to you, but there's no reason to apologize. There were no hers. The student was also advised to recall his experience with antique casts and to apply their classical proportions to the live model. So this is very important. And I'm going to show you a couple of etudes from the live model in a moment. In your training, the casts, as I said, were made from what were recognized to be some of the greatest works of the classical age. Casts were made from the Parthenon sculptures, for instance. Casts were made from very famous works such as the Doryphorus by Polykleitos, which was known in a Roman copy, but copies could be made. And these works, which were Greek via Roman copies very often, and then casts, were works that were considered ideal representations of the human form. That a sculptor like Polykleitos had developed a very perfect canon of proportion, of representation, and an ideal of beauty. Well, that's the way you learned. You learned from the Greeks, all right, via the Romans and via copies. So when it came to your actually drawing from the live model, you were expected to perfect the model. If the model had one bicep a little bit larger on one side than the other, or some kind of imperfection in one leg as opposed to the other, you were expected to fix it. You were expected to make it look perfect. So here are some drawings from the cast. These are called Études d'après la bosse, studies after the cast. So a very famous work here on the right-hand side, the Spinario, which was known from excavations at Pompeii. I believe there was a copy of it in Florence. And then this is obviously sort of a Roman classical-looking sandal and foot that you see on the left-hand side. Just as the Greeks had emphasized the nude as a metaphor for perfection and ideal beauty, so the nude and drawing from the live model was considered exceedingly important, and you had to be completely competent. These are what are called academies. An academie is a study after nature. So these are live model works. And what's interesting is the one on the left is much more idealized, I think made more perfect, although if you look at his head and face, you can see he's an individual, pretty good-looking model. Well, whereas this man on the right is sort of a little stumpier looking, doesn't have quite that long flow. You can see again, that's the model's face with the mustache. Corrections of defects as you are drawing by the masters could involve anything from just verbal remarks in passing around the atelier to Ingres, whom I told you we're going to talk about, who went through the whole academic system, who would go up to his students' work and he would scratch with his fingernail on the work, can you imagine, and say, "Take this out, this doesn't work here." Oh, I can just imagine the scraping of fingernails on the paper. So you might be asking, where are we going with all of this? We're supposed to be looking at painting. Painting was taught only after the pupil demonstrated a thorough grasp of drawing. Pupils were advised to keep a sketchbook and visit the Louvre to sketch portions of great works of art. The master would then assign the student to create a precise copy of a great master. Now, you may have noticed if you've traveled and gone into museums that many museums do allow access to artists who you have to pay a license fee, and you can actually bring in your materials and you can set up your easel. Yes, have you ever seen this in a museum? It's really interesting. In front of a work, and you can make a copy. And this is very commonly still done so that artists are really learning while they are copying from a master. Today, you are usually, in most museums, you're not allowed to make a copy that's the same size as the original. In France, in the period that we're talking about, you were expected to make an exact copy. So, the exact copy had practical importance for the artist's education because it was believed that a perfect copy that imitated all the techniques, the palette, the subject, everything identical, indicated that you had fully learned what you needed to know to be a painter. If you painted something that was an interpretation, my interpretation of Giorgione, obviously that would be considered completely inappropriate. It's completely commonplace and valueless. A final point, and I'm showing you here the original Giorgione, the Fête Champêtre, down below. I don't have it in color, but here's the Fête Champêtre copy by one of the great academic painters of the 19th century. We'll be talking about him again, Alexandre Cabanel. That's his copy, an exact copy. And, you know, the master who assigned it to him would have said to him, it's perfect. A final point, which has major consequences for the evolution of painting in the 19th century, has to do with the preparatory sketch. So, down below, well, I should probably ask you, but I've already said it, and I think you can tell. You have good eyes. I have a lot of artists in here. That's the sketch down below. Well, I can ask you, how do I know that? How do I know that's the sketch? And that that's the finished work? Come on, just look. Well, I don't have the sketch in color. I'm sorry, again, I don't have it. So you have to look at other things. How do we know that's the sketch down below? Really? I'm really going to be training. I'm going to whip you guys into shape when it comes to looking, because I don't think you believe what you're seeing. What's different between these two works besides the color that I can't, you know? There are changes, yes, but what do you see that's so different? Okay, the top one has more detail, and what does that result from? Why is there more detail? There are no faces in the bottom, right? Yeah, more definite, more linear, more contoured. You see what I'm getting at here? There's a tremendous amount of freedom, almost like interpretive freedom, in the work down below. That's the sketch. That's the sketch. Would you ever submit a sketch, even though it's a painting, would you submit that as a finished work to the salon jury? No. Why not? Well, it's so blurry and it's so, soft line and where are the lines and contours? So what do? You go through this process, this sort of procreative process in terms of finishing the work. And the finished work, the fini, is tight, isn't it? I always tell my students, imagine for an academic work, stylistically, that you could put a piece of tracing paper over it, and you could absolutely go around every single contour and outline, okay? That's a tight academic classical work. Whereas the work down below, aren't you going to have problems with that tracing paper business? It's going to be really hard to find the exact contour or outline. So what you're seeing is the fini up above. You would never show a final sketch as a finished work, because the purpose of a sketch is to give the idea of the painting that is to come. It is gestation and procreation, and gives you the effect, but it's not a finished work. For the academician, then, the sketch remains only one step in the production of a finished work. It will never suffice to demonstrate an artist's ultimate talent. A good sketch is great, but it's not a work of art. It's a sketch. It's part of the process. It has to be translated into great art. But as tastes and approaches to style changed in the 19th century, emphasis would be shifted from the final refined phase to a great interest in the generative, spontaneous phase. From the academic point of view, no two things could be more opposed than a sketch and a finished work. We know which one is art. Thus, we can begin to understand academic reaction to Impressionist works, such as Claude Monet's Sunrise, 1872. The Impressionists, in their concern for light and its effect on objects, tried to find a technique, a style, that could bring the viewer closer to that initial visual impression of that moment in time. And they had to simplify their painting technique to capture what for them was reality, but which certainly for academic painters had nothing to do with reality. As far as the academicians were concerned, the Impressionists were trying to pass off a sketch as a finished painting, and this was intolerable to the traditions of the Academy. Any questions?